Hey guys, welcome back. BDCKR here. We're back with Season 8, Episode 5 of our weekly Q&A videos that used to have a lot longer name that I almost said just now. But then I realized we made it easier on ourselves again. But if you are currently watching this on YouTube, we don't mention this every time because people don't care that much. But if you're, you can check out the links in the description to access this on all the major podcasting platforms.
Yeah.
We don't have as much stuff. We don't really have anything to talk about ourselves this week.
Well,
to start. Or did you want to?
You know, it's fresh on our minds because we were watching this over dinner. Boys.
Oh, The Boys,
Season 2
okay.
On Amazon Prime.
That's true.
And I guess it's perfectly fitting today's Prime Day. So all the more reason to talk about, but holy moly.
Really good.
Yeah, I think when we were first talking about it, so first season was really good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you were a little bit skeptical on the second season for a little while about just
whether
it was as good.
I wasn't sure if it was as good. I wasn't sure how it stacked up. Because, you know, when you have such a spectacular first season, it's hard, right? You don't have, like, the same sort of really, like, when there's landmark scenes in the first season. There's a couple scenes that really spring to mind when you think about The Boys.
You lose the benefit of being fresh and new.
Yeah.
Of discovering something.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like in sports. It's like in TV shows. It's like everywhere. The sophomore slump is a real thing. Because do you just give people more of what they liked the first time around?
Yeah.
Or do you go in another direction and risk alienating people?
Mm-hmm.
And
it's so good. It really, we're not all the way through it yet, but
No.
It is spectacular. And so one thing I want to say specifically, this is just relevant to us. I'm going to do my best to not spoil anything. I think I won't spoil anything. There's one character in the show who...
In the second season.
Who the major sort of twist for their character is telegraphed in their name.
Yeah.
So if you see, and I think that's not a spoiler, because if you if you're seeing the names of the new characters introduced in season 2, if none of the names mean anything, you don't need to look them up, right?
Yeah.
But I think the only way that that's a spoiler is if you already know what we know about what connotations the name has,
right?
And then also recognize that when you see the character name. And I just think it got such clever, sharp writing, and its name is such that their name is such that you can both know about what sort of the alternate meaning of the name is,
right?
And still not telegraph the twist, because you already got to the point where the twist was like half revealed.
So this is what it does really so well as a show. So there's clearly a larger story arc, and I mean, this didn't always used to be a common thing.
Yeah.
In TV shows, there are a lot of, say, police procedurals where each show was sort of self-contained. It was the same characters. There wasn't a lot at stake in each episode that had an impact on the rest of the season or the show itself.
Yeah.
This clearly has a really good arc, and I think a lot of the dramas in the last 20 years have done that, and they've taken their cues from the really successful shows, right? Like, off the top of my head, The Sopranos, Breaking Bad, Dexter. Again, really interesting because it's got the big story arc, but it also has these
subplots.
Yeah, there's all these different threads that interweave, and this is what we were talking about earlier, where it's what makes it so good. It's not just a compelling story, but it's seeing the art of putting all these things together.
Yeah.
And you were saying, and I was thinking about this when you were saying that it was very much like the way Tim Powers writes books, where there's stuff that's happening in sort of real life.
Yeah.
That if you know it enriches it a little bit more, and he's taken all these elements of the story and put them into the context and made it fit in a way.
Yeah.
That's really quite clever.
Yeah, so it's like the more you know about, like, politics, American nationalism, there's a bunch of little threads, and obviously one of the reasons why it's tying these things together is because it's like a satire, right? So you do have to sort of root that in something real. But it works as a drama without satire. It works as comedy, like a dramedy without satire too. It just all is enhanced by a lot of really sort of interesting, and it's not always subtle satire. Yeah. Like, I don't even want to spoil anything for the show.
But the other thing that really, I mean, it reminds me of so many other things, other stories where the conceit being that superheroes are real, but then they flesh out the rest of the world in a way that makes it just so much more, it feels much more vibrant and alive in a way. Yeah. Without taking away, like, there's an example, I don't know if did you ever read Astro City?
I didn't.
That was a comic book series, Kurt Busiek, covers by Alex Ross, and I think Brent Anderson did the art for most of the issues. And I lost track of it. I followed maybe the first year or two, and it was really good. That sort of, we're used to so many superhero stories where the suspension of disbelief doesn't stop with just the superheroes. Like, there's a lot of other things going on, and it seems like they introduce a lot of other stuff. And I think in the late 80s, I want to say, they took it in a direction where it became a little bit more realistic. And I mean, Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen was really responsible for this. But what the comic book writers took away,
and I've heard the Watchmen TV series is really good too.
I heard that too.
We need to watch that soon.
But a lot of sort of the writers who saw the success and tried to imitate it took the wrong thing. Instead of the depth of storytelling, what they did was they just, it's grimdark. Yeah. So they just made everything really dark and angry and violent. And I mean, if you do it well, it's okay, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah. So one of the things that The Boys also makes me think of, I was in a group chat, and there was a bunch of people who watched and loved the show in varying amounts of progress through the second season, who were all trying to sell it to one person who had never seen it before. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to think of things to compare it to. And I think what it reminds me of a little bit is, if you remember the early Iron Man movies, like the first and second Iron Man movies. Okay. Sort of the way that in the first Iron Man movie, he has to grapple with the fact that Stark Industries has been making weapons for terrorists and selling weapons to terrorists. And then in the second movie, or third movie, or one of the later movies, where there's that scene where he's like at a party, right? Because he's publicly Iron Man and he's hosting a party, and he's walking around in the suit, and he's going, everybody's asking me, Iron Man, how do you pee in the suit? And he goes, just like that. And he goes, and sort of those scenes, right? Where it was really sort of grounded, and it was trying its best to place Tony Stark and that character in what felt like a more real world context. Yeah. And so it reminds me a lot of that, which the Marvel movies have totally lost at this point.
You think so? I'm trying to think back when if there was a tonal shift like that when that happened.
Well, that was the beginning, right? That was Iron Man. That was the first Iron Man movies. Though that was really grounded. And then you see Iron Man in the new movies. You've got the emotional beats of things happening to them, but you don't have that sort of what is even the connection to the real world other than the fact that it's being threatened?
I don't know. Okay, so I don't know why. I can't think of an instance, but I feel like the Avengers was grounded still like that. And it wasn't even like a reality grounded scene. It's that scene where the Hulk is tossing Loki back and forth like that. Yeah. Like it feels, I don't know. I'm not so good at breaking it down in terms of the concrete stuff, but it's the emotional. Again,
it's emotional. They're still emotionally grounded, but that's not that. You're in a massive tower and there are aliens pouring out of the sky and everything. By that point, when we're talking about that in Iron Man, it's a dude in a cool suit, right? Right. And but I think to me, The Boys has managed to both give people basically whatever powers they want. I don't think when I'm looking at The Boys as a show, I don't think there's a huge amount of explanation. Sort of approximately where people's powers come from, but there's not an explanation of every individual's powers, what they can do, what their sort of limitations are, what they have. There's no attempt to really ground what their bodies are doing. Right. Which is fine. I don't care. But there's the way that they ground it in the real world. Yeah. Is so much stronger than I think anything that pretty much any other superhero media has done.
Okay. And now I'm gonna age myself a little bit. Is that how I'm gonna? It just occurred to me. I don't know why I never thought of this. The Wild Card series, that was edited by George R. R. Martin. Yeah. Did this really, really well back in the 80s. And it was a whole series of, there was a Mosaic type novel series. So Mosaic being one story, but it was broken up into different perspectives. Sort of the same way A Song of Ice and Fire is.
Yeah.
So it's one big story, different perspectives, but the different perspectives were written by different writers.
Okay.
And
like Will Grayson.
Yeah, sort of like that. That was John Green and John Levitan.
David Levitan?
Oh, God, yeah. It's been a while since I've read that. Yep, you're absolutely right. So, yeah, and it was... Oh, I gotta go back to read. I remember when I first started reading that, it was really great. Yeah. And he left it for a while and has come back to it recently. And I never picked up the thread when it came back. But the first few books were really spectacular because nobody else is doing anything like that. I mean, everybody's... Well, I don't want to say everybody, but it's been... That ground has been, especially with all the superhero movies, has been really, tilled and what... there's a
like retread
metaphor for it. Like it's been well worn.
Yeah.
But I remember when Wild Cards first came out, it was pretty, like it was really fresh.
Yeah.
Had great Tim Truman covers. So Tim Truman was a comic book artist who became famous for doing his own project, Scout. He wrote it and he drew it. I've got a sketch from him. I met him at a convention once, and he did. Anyways, that's a story for another time. But so yeah, I get. Oh, I gotta pull out those copies. You gotta read Wild Cards. It's. I think you'll enjoy it.
Okay.
I think anybody listening to it, anybody who's read Boys, and I hope my memory hasn't failed me. But if you're listening to this, you really enjoy Boys, you gotta read The Boys. I'd recommend the Wild Card series.
Okay. Yeah. But I guess the main takeaway, The Boys Season 2 is really good. If you haven't watched either Season 1 or Season 2, we highly recommend it. I think when we're through the show, we probably will come back with thoughts about specific scenes.
Yeah, and a bit of a spoilery kind of...
Yeah, because I think we've done our best not to spoil anything significant here. The kind of level of spoilers that you could expect to see by watching like a trailer, or like looking at like promotional material for it,
right?
Hopefully,
right.
So yeah, but it's really good. It does a great job of what it wants to do, and it's made us think about like the process of making TV. We had to look up because they keep mentioning Fresca in this season, and it's from the first moment that it comes up, it's very clear, right? Like they're not like just showing Fresca labeled prominently. The like somebody offers somebody Fresca and the line is, you want a Fresca? And it struck me as so weird to specifically label it by brand
right
name.
It stands out. And then we had that discussion about whether you're allowed to do that. And I think my gut reaction was that you are, and the reason why certain things don't show up is it's an opportunity to sell product placement in whatever media you're doing. Yeah,
and I looked it up, and there's all this stuff about like brand dilution and blah blah blah, and all the reasons why people can and can't use brands in their stuff. But it's one of those shows that really like it makes you think, but it's also some of the best action on TV in recent memory. I don't know. I couldn't point to another piece of like television that has as consistently good action in a long time.
What do you consider? I mean, do you consider Netflix television? Like,
if it's Netflix is TV.
So is it? So it has to be episodic then.
I think so. Yeah, it can't be like a single piece of like. I think if it's in one big thing, it's a movie, whether or not it's like a Netflix original or whatever.
Right. Okay.
And even if it's in like 4 chapters or something, that's like a limited run series to me.
I'll tell you what I really liked as far as an action piece that I guess would qualify as a movie then.
Yeah.
Old Guard. And it was, again, that was another comic-based property.
Yeah. I really liked it. I actually saw something afterwards from a stunt person saying that the Old Guard's action was actually one of its weaker things.
Really?
Yeah. And that it was it was alright for action, but not... But
you know what? It was in service to the story.
Yeah.
What I like about it, I mean, action is kind of cool. I mean, who doesn't like a spectacle, right? I mean, that was the draw of something like Transformers. So where you just watch something that just looks really cool. But I think because it's so much integral to the story that it just it lifts everything up. Everything seems better for having a final product that's just so
And
Good.
yeah, it's entirely possible that his concerns with it, I think that was from the Corridor Crew channel. YouTube channel is the Stuntmen React to like bad and great Hollywood stunts, whatever. One of the more recent ones, probably the most recent one, if anyone's looking for the specific video where I'm talking about. And it's entirely possible that that's the kind of thing that doesn't read to people who aren't as knowledgeable about it. Right? Because it didn't really read to me when I was watching the movie. I didn't have any problem with the action. I never looked at it and said, this is spectacular action. I thought the stuff that was happening was cool. I never looked at like the scene and said, wow, that's choreographed really well. Or like, wow, that, like, you know, that's a really cool fight, right? Specifically. So it was a good movie that had action in it.
Yes,
that's
a good point.
I don't know if I would have called it out specifically, like, for its action.
I think, you know why it stood out in my mind is that I think I've watched a lot of action movies where the action seems to be the point.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed it so much more, that and The Boys, because it's really, you can't pull it away from the story. It's not like something where it's an excuse to put some action in. It really is necessary for that story.
Mm-hmm. And to be fair, when I say that the action is really good in The Boys, most of the examples I'm thinking of aren't really traditional action so much as like violence, like CGI, like violence. Like it's got really good visual effects. And a lot of it is like, I can't point to a specific fight scene and they go, oh, this fight was choreographed really well or shot really well. It really is most of when I'm thinking about action is I'm considering like, wow, that was a really impactful use of extreme violence in the show. Right? Which is, I think, maybe a little different. So action might not be the right word when I say that either. But
it enhances the story. This is it. It fleshes it out. It makes it just more full and rich.
Yeah. And I without literally just calling it violence, I don't know what other way to refer to it. And there are multiple scenes that are, you know, really impactful for what's happening on screen, separate from the story as a visual spectacle where you just go, oh my god. And I don't, like, the more I think about it, I'm not even sure if action is exactly the right term, but I don't know what else I would call it. Yeah. It's good. It's really good is the main takeaway. And I think we've talked for long enough about it. Free advertising for The Boys. But yeah, it's worth watching.
You can send your check to us.
They did do a ton of advertising ahead of on YouTube. They like hired different like YouTubers.
Oh, did they?
To do ad stuff for it. Yeah,
we clearly don't have a high enough profile.
Well, yeah, these people like millions of subscribers. They did like Michael Reeves did something, and Jax Films did something.
I don't even know who Michael Reeves is.
He does robots.
Okay,
he's fun. He's like this short, half Filipino dude from Hawaii who does like a bunch of like weird robots and stuff. He's a good time. I recommend his channel. It's very fun. There we go. That's 2 recommendations. The Boys, Michael Reeves. But getting into our first question.
Or the tail end of the question from last time that we had to cut off.
Yeah, that's true. So this is still talking to Ember Mist, who has continued to do our timestamps. So we should start off by saying thank you to Ember Mist for the timestamps. Appreciated. And so this is the next part of the comment about political stuff. So what we didn't get to last time, literally none of the recent police killings were because of race. George Floyd? Nope. The officer already knew him from another job. And one of the 3 officers that didn't do anything about Chauvin clearly wasn't white. Rayshard Brooks? He was doing fine until he fought 2 police, took either their taser or their gun, and then in brackets I think it was their gun, then ran away with it while pointing it at the officers. Jacob Blake? He already had an active warrant out for him. The officer came over there because of a domestic abuse call, which I believe are some of the most deadly situations for officers. Blake had a knife, according to the Department of Justice. The officer heard a woman say, I was going to say Dawn of Justice because it's DOJ and I'm in injustice mode. Had a knife, according to the Department of Justice. The officer heard a woman say that he had her kid, in quotes, and the officer already failed a tase attempt when he was going to the car. At this point, the only force he could use was his hands or a gun. Holding his back wasn't working, so he shot. If he didn't, he could have kidnapped a kid, stabbed 1 or more people, or got a gun that the police didn't know about. I don't know much about Daniel Prude, other than the fact that he was definitely on tons of drugs. The other guy whose name I don't know, he was literally running at the police with a knife. I'm not racist for wanting to care or treat people differently because... for not wanting to care. Did I say that? Yeah. For not wanting to care or treat people differently because of race. Nor am I dog whistling to white nationalists.
So, all right, so just a totally not relevant point. So originally, taser stands for something. I know it's gotten into the common usage where tase is the verb now, but it used to be that the style guides, it was tasering.
Yeah.
So if you didn't tase somebody, you tasered somebody. And I don't know where that transition happened. I guess it's because it feels like
language works.
A writer writes, a taser tases, like that kind of thing. So it's funny how it shifted, because in my mind it still feels like it should be tasered or tasering, but I guess it's just,
And so I think, like, we definitely disagree on
not you and me.
Not you and me, but we disagree with the sort of comments by Ember Mist here to say that these things weren't because of race. I think the problem is, and again, I'm going to sort of try to pull what I can from the prejudice class that I'm taking, which is that explicit prejudice and explicit voice prejudice has decreased super dramatically. Right. And it is, rapidly becoming something that is not present in polite society anymore. Right? Where there's nobody who is generally considered reasonable who is vocally talking about prejudice. Right. But implicit prejudice and stereotypes and those biases has not actually changed that much in a very long time. Like in when you look at the time frame that they've been looking at prejudice, as explicit has declined, implicit has remained relatively static. And so explicit prejudice and implicit prejudice both predict behavior in certain situations. And implicit prejudice best predicts behavior when people don't have enough time to engage in effortful, conscious, active thought.
Higher faculty thinking.
Yeah. So when people have their snap judgments, snap decisions, their initial judgments of people, and this is unavoidable.
So your unconscious bias
you'll look at
more makes more of a difference when you don't actually have time to consciously make a decision.
So your implicit bias engages right away, and so there's been a bunch of tasks and things that have tested that people are more likely to misinterpret something being held in the hands of a black person as a weapon. And so they'll do I forget what it's called. It's some shooter task that I think I actually did a modified version of, where they'll present you with sort of random backgrounds, people in the backgrounds, and they'll either be holding a weapon or a non-weapon, like a tool of some kind.
Or a bag of M&Ms.
No, it's all non-weapon tools.
No, I'm just saying. I'm thinking of Trayvon Martin. Was it Trayvon Martin that had a bag of M&Ms?
Oh,
somebody did.
Yeah. I'm not 100% sure of the name.
Maybe it was a toy gun. That was different, but there's an M&M somewhere there.
And they found that pretty reliably, people, especially non-black people, will have a bias against black people and are more likely to, quote unquote, fire, right? At black person holding a non-gun tool than a white person. And there's different breakdowns for each race. I don't have the information in front of me, so I'm not going to make any claim, but there's certain populations, I believe Muslim and black people are two of the races who are more likely to have ambiguous stimuli interpreted as weapons, right? Where you have to spend more time thinking about it, and you'd have to actively. So when they make you, they give you a limited amount of time. When they make you a sort of a gut decision, where you have to scan it, and you don't have time to really engage that conscious thought process, you're much more likely to. Or people as a whole are much more likely to. And cops specifically.
I guess the people that they studied. So what you're saying is that the group that they studied included police officers.
I know that the study has been done with police officers.
So it's been repeated.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying.
Yeah. And so it's obviously not everybody individually is more likely.
I'm curious about how they selected the groups of people to look at.
Yeah, and so that's a good point too. We're not trying to say that, any one study proves something definitively, right? Because that's not how research works.
Right.
But the body of evidence suggests with a relatively high degree of confidence that, situations like this, people are engaged in unconscious bias.
Because you can't test everybody. I mean, that's part of how research works, is that you sample a group and you hope that it represents a larger group that you actually want to study.
And there's also, so there's unconscious bias, but there's also the distinction between unconscious bias and unspoken bias, which is bias that you are aware of, but that you know you can't say.
Right.
And maybe bias that you would even deny yourself having, right? But that exists, where you will say, well, I don't think black people are any worse than white people. I just think, like, they're committing crimes and they're making worse decisions, right?
Right.
Which is still an example of bias, right? Bias towards a racial group.
Right.
And, you know, people can argue about, like, well, it's not bias, it's true, blah, blah, blah. I'm not... That example maybe plays into people, like, pulling for research. But separate from that, like, in general, you can have biases against groups that are not substantiated by any evidence or not substantiated by good evidence, right?
Right.
That you hold, that you would... If somebody said, are you racist? Do you have a bias against black people? You go, no, right? But then you still have these beliefs that are damaging in one way or the other.
Right.
Yeah. And that's also... There's also... This isn't 100% relevant for what we're talking about, but just while we're here, there's also the idea of, like, ambivalent stereotyping, where you have a mix, so ambivalent, ambivalent, so two valences, which is good and bad stereotypes, which are both damaging. So one of the things with this, our society as it exists right now, is that we do have ambivalent stereotypes about a lot of discriminated against groups. And so another way that people say that they're not racist is, or not sexist or anything, is by saying, well, here are the good things that I think about this group of people. And a lot of
the good things aren't that great either.
Yeah. So, the easiest example for this is sexism. I don't want to get too far off the race thing, and we're going to come back to it, right? But for sexism, one of the things is that a lot of people are like, oh, well, women are a lot more nurturing, they're better at caring for people, they are good in sort of that motherly role, right? And that is something that you would call a positive perspective on somebody. You go, oh, you know, you're great, you're so supportive, right? But those stereotypes for women still do actually end up damaging them by restricting the opportunities that they're given. Right. You are giving people more credit when they are remain in stereotype affirming roles. And so for women who are nurturing and who enjoy being nurturing and who for that it is inherently satisfying and good for them, it's not as damaging. But for people who are trying to be in business, for anyone who is trying to exist outside of that stereotype is limiting.
Right. So it feels like, I know it's not the same thing, but if I want to draw that back to racism, then it feels, in terms of an attack, the same way that the model minority idea works.
And for black people specifically, it's one of the positive stereotypes is sports.
Right.
Athleticism, strength, physical ability, right? Where you are saying, well, like, you know, no, I think black people are great. I mean, look, all my favorite, like, basketball players are black. And they're good at this, and, you know, there's, like, everybody's heard stereotypes about, black people in athleticism, right? And that is ostensibly, theoretically, you say, well, they're good at these things, you know, this is a thing that I, like about them. It seems like it's helpful, but it is still sort of limiting and not great. And this isn't what the commenter was talking about. Amber Miss didn't mention anything about sports at all, but just while we're here, I think
it comes back to the idea of the implicit bias, right?
Yeah.
And that just because there was an officer there that wasn't white doesn't mean that he couldn't have been biased himself.
Yeah.
And just because they knew each other we're speaking to the two cases that have gotten the most prominence that I've heard about the most, which is George Floyd and Jacob Blake, right? Mm-hmm. And just because he knew him before doesn't mean that there wasn't racism in their interaction before that either, right?
He could have not liked him because he was black.
Yeah.
In their previous interaction. There could have been a bunch of stuff. So, was it only race and nothing else?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
But no situation is only race and nothing else.
Right.
There's always an environment surrounding it. But yeah, you know, the fact that the police officer knew him before is terrible. And it makes it less about just a racist cop stopping a random black dude on the street.
Right.
But it does not make it any less about racism.
Right. So, and let's look at let's say it's not racism. Let's say in the case of Jacob Blake, if we read this right, he had a knife. You're an officer and you hear a woman saying that he has her kid.
Yeah.
And tried to taser him and he wouldn't stop. And so the only force he could use was his hands or a gun. Holding his back wasn't working, so he shot. So to me, this is the perfect example where whatever training this person had completely failed him. He shot him 7 times to the back. He followed him closely enough, holding on to his shirt to be in danger from a knife if there was one. Didn't need to get to the car.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, did he pat him down before he grabbed him? Mm-hmm. Did he do something? You know what I mean? I mean, all that stuff to get to that moment where he could plausibly say he felt like he was in danger. He was in danger the moment he got close enough to grab him. Mm-hmm. And to use that to justify shooting somebody sometimes back, I mean, it boggles my mind. I mean, I've seen the training or seen some of the discussion where people talk about how within a certain number of feet where you think that you're actually not in any danger, that's safe distance, that you are, even if you have a gun, somebody with a knife can
sprint at you,
hurt you before you've even had a chance to do anything with it.
Yeah.
So that whole idea that, now he feels like he's in danger. Well, how do you think he got to that point where he was in so much danger? He did it to himself. The police officer I'm talking about.
We've mentioned this before, we'll mention it again. That's not what due process is, right? Yeah. Like, there's an assumption of innocence until proven guilty. The way the justice system is meant to work, he shouldn't be able to shoot somebody because he thinks they might be attempting to access a weapon that he has not yet seen, right? Yeah. There's no sort of situation
especially when he could have done so many things leading up to that point where he could have mitigated the potential risk himself.
Yeah, but even if, we're existing in a situation where we say he did literally everything he could, right, up until that point, up until the point where he fired 7 rounds into his back, right? That's not due process. It's not acceptable. That's excessive use of force at the very least. That's not neutralizing somebody, right?
Right.
You don't need to shoot anybody 7 times
in the back,
right? In the back. Yeah. There's no situation in which the first shot it connects and the next in between the next 6.
You're talking point blank range, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even you talk about video games. What is it? Double tap? I'm just saying.
There's nothing. Yeah.
Again,
there's no situation.
Somebody's clearly lost control of the situation. That kind of person should not be a police officer, whether he's holding on to somebody who's white or black. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes a question of, well, is this more likely to happen if the person they're trying to apprehend is not white?
Yeah.
That's the other. I mean, it's a secondary question. You can never sort of tease those apart completely.
Yeah. So this is another thing, which is that you can say that race wasn't involved, and when there's no explicit racism happening, you can't ever say like this % of the situation was due to race, and this % of the situation was due to training, and this % of the situation, right? You can't.
It's not a recipe.
Yeah. You can never sort of go back and untangle things unless it's like a member of the KKK who did it, right? Unless you start from a point where somebody looks you in the face and goes, this is exactly why I did it, and they're saying something that is horrible enough that they would never say to try to make themselves look better, that they have no motivation for saying. That's the only situation in which you can say this is fully racially motivated. If a KKK member goes, I lynched that person because they're black, that's the only time that you can say that was a fully racially motivated event.
Okay, I don't even know why I'm thinking about this now. So the stuff you're talking about where people will tell you something or tell others something or maybe even tell themselves something because that's what they believe. Mm-hmm. I used to find the show Big Brother really interesting because of that split. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting because there was so much footage that was available. Like they're basically in the house 24 hours being filmed all the time, that you could see how they would try to present themselves in the confession room.
Yeah.
But you could also see what they'd actually done. And it was so interesting to me how that stark difference
between their like self-perception and their front-facing persona.
Yes, that was always so interesting to me because I don't think there's other opportunities to see that the same way.
Yeah.
Where you can, I mean, and these weren't necessarily bad people, but they had a story in their head where they were the hero, and it allows them to rewrite history a little bit. I'm sure there's a more elegant term for it, but where they can
be a little revisionist.
Yeah, and they get to still think of themselves as good guys when clearly they do something that's wrong without having to be accountable for it.
Yeah. So I'm going to be that annoying person who keeps bringing it back to like cold hard research, but hopefully for anybody who's trying to actively engage in good faith with this conversation, that's actually useful and good. So we've talked about that sort of bias in decision making due to race when there are situations where you don't have enough time to engage in your conscious thought process. Yeah. Now I want to talk about, because the situations that we mentioned here are all, for one reason or another, slightly ambiguous, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes what's ambiguous is our interpretation of it afterwards, and sometimes what's ambiguous is the interpretation that the police officer needs to make, right? So in the case of George Floyd, the ambiguity in the situation is, the sort of combination of factors because they knew each other beforehand. And when we talk about the example of getting shot in the back 7 times. Jacob Blake. Yeah, the name was escaping me, and I know it's bad. We should do our best to sort of remember that stuff, but there's a lot of information, and I'm sort of just trying to process it best I can. Jacob Blake, the ambiguity of the situation that the police officer had to assess was what was the risk to himself and other people. Right? So the research on ambiguous situations also shows that when you don't have explicit prejudice, when somebody says, I'm not racist, and they are being honest in their own perception when they say that, they're like, I don't have racial bias, ambiguous situations will tend to manifest that racial bias. Mm-hmm. So what happens is, one of the better examples of this is a study where they had individuals put in applications for a position, and then they had participants rate those applications. So there was different sort of mixtures. So there was people who were clearly bad candidates, there were people who were clearly the best candidates, and then there was ambiguous candidates where they were better in some fields and worse in other fields. Right. And so for the clearly good candidates, there was no racial bias exhibited when people were, approving them for jobs. Right. But the second that there was, there were ambiguous candidates where there was one, white candidate who was better at one thing but worse at another thing, and then a black candidate who was better at the thing that the white person was worse at, but then a little bit worse at, like, in terms of education or job experience or whatever. Right. What they found was that there was a consistent racial bias, and they would justify it by changing the weighing scales for each of the factors. Wow. So that what factor was important. So they were like, well, they would give it to the white person more often, and then I'd say, well, the reason why I gave it to the white person is because the skills that they had are more important to this job than these other skills. And so there's still, there is a racial bias in situations where you have ambiguous information. And even if somebody is not explicitly racist, but not even, more than not explicitly racist, even somebody who does not believe they are racist and genuinely thinks that that is true, will exhibit racial bias in situations where they're given ambiguous information that they have to process and assign weight to individual parts of it.
As you're talking about that and, ambiguity and the chance to actually think things through, part of me wonders if the reason why George Floyd's situation was so much more strikingly awful was because it was so long. There was so much time. Yeah. And there was the opportunity for somebody to, maybe your gut reaction.
Yeah. It wasn't like 10 seconds of firing.
Right. And so it becomes much harder to justify it as an sort of a being caught up in the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because every second was a new opportunity to think it through and come to like a conclusion, change your mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that is a good point. I think that's also why the length of time was such an important part of some people's messaging when they're talking about it.
Right.
Right? I forget was it like 7 minutes and 13 seconds or something like that?
I think it was like 8 minutes, I think. It was somewhere... Yeah. It was just
I don't
ridiculous.
remember what it was specifically, but it
like
was...
when you talk in my work, I ask people like how long did it last, and I ask them about stuff that happens for a short moment, and then they'll say for a minute or two. I said, do you really mean a minute? Or do you mean like this is just something you're throwing out? Maybe it was like a few seconds. And he said, I don't know. And I'll say, okay, so how about we do this? And I'll just start my watch and say, we're going to just wait.
For how long it felt like it was, yeah.
Or even, I go one of two ways. I can say how long it felt like it was, or I can say, let's wait for 2 minutes. And then see, did it feel like, was it like that? And the work I do, it sort of matters. Like it helps sort of figure out different things. But it's like, yeah, exactly. That people have a different sense of time when things are happening. Mm-hmm. And to me, when you're 8 minutes is ridiculously long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's just another thing. And I think I am going to say, for the study that I just mentioned, one of the things that is not, like, one of the ways that is not fully applicable to these situations is those show both out-group derogation and in-group, I forget what the term is, it's elevation. So, when you're a white person who's choosing to hire a white person, right? It's not as clear if what behavior you're exhibiting there is any sentiment against black people or if it's just more positive sentiment towards white people.
Right.
So it's not exactly as applicable here because you're not choosing between, a white person to kill in the street and a black person to kill in the street. You're choosing to kill or not kill a black person when we're talking about these killings, right? So it is a little bit different, but I just think it's sort of important to note that, racism, racial prejudice, and racially prejudiced actions still exist in situations in which individuals can fully believe that they don't have any racial bias.
Yeah.
And a lot of these situations include a lot of sort of the magic ingredients to make people behave in more prejudiced ways.
Mm.
So to say that race had nothing to do with these situations is, I think...
You just can't say that.
Yeah, I think it's pretty across the board inaccurate.
Until we can read people's minds.
Yeah, with all the information that we have, I don't think it's fair to make that claim.
And I guess even if we can read people's minds, sometimes your reaction doesn't sort of bubble up high enough into the higher cortical functioning to be able to even be conscious of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say on this. We talked for a while.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talking about this. We're not going to get through all these questions.
We're not. We're going to have more.
We talked for so long. Okay, so we've got another question from Ember Mist.
That was the follow-up.
Yeah,
this is the timestamps from last week when we answered his question or their question and didn't even get through it all.
Yeah, so that's fine. But anyways, this is responding to, again, last week where part of their question from last week was looking up how many unarmed black people were killed by police.
Yeah.
Or telling us to say how many it was without looking it up.
Right.
Yeah. And so the answer to that, the answer is 13. I can't find exact statistics by demographic, but annual police interactions for black people are in the millions every year in our lifetimes. Also, Democrats have control of the majority of the policy in areas that this is happening in. What have Republicans done in Chicago?
Okay, so you know what? Let me answer the second part first, because I feel like we've got to do some injustice stuff.
Yeah, maybe.
So let me read the injustice question. So it says, for injustice, which metal character do you think gains the most from evolving? I think it's New 52 Shazam, due to him being able to make himself and any Justice League teammate invulnerable to basic and special attacks. And
yeah, we'll answer that first.
I want to say, I think Batman Ninja Catwoman gains the most, because the longer duration her passive is active, the more powerful she is. And she's already powerful even without boosting her passive, so maybe you'll make the argument that her starting point is higher, so the fact that she ends up way higher when her passive increases the duration. Mm-hmm. But I think that is just so much better than anything else, that she starts off at a higher point and she gets even higher for every second she gains, that much more powerful.
Man, do you remember when we were in an Injustice YouTube channel? I do. I don't know. We went...
Look at the visuals. The visuals are still...
Yeah, we went 44 minutes and we've talked for like 35 seconds about Injustice. I'm calling the boys...
We talked about the boys.
Yeah, that's superhero, but I don't know if that counts.
Yeah.
So... We're real full of ourselves now, huh?
I mean, so the problem, I think, is that in the States, it's gotten very much a partisan kind of Democrats versus Republicans.
Yeah.
I don't think it really matters. I don't know that necessarily all the Democrats are somehow enlightened progressives, although they claim to be.
Yeah, and I think, like, my main thing, I don't think politicians, for, like, in certain states, have a huge amount of control over directly what happens in police stations.
Yeah.
I think you can sort of change stuff in sweeping ways, budget being the main one.
Right.
But on a sort of more granular level, I think it's one of those departments that, unless there's been a bunch of external push for a change, they sort of manage themselves. And I think both Democrats and Republicans do a real crappy job holding them accountable. So I would say,
And as groups, but I think there are individuals that are often more likely to be Democrats. Like, I'm a really big fan of AOC.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the stuff that I believe is in line with what the kind of policies she's pushing for. But it's easy because a lot of stuff she's pushing for, we already have it in Canada.
Yeah, and it's good in Canada.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I shouldn't say a lot, but in terms of the biggest part of the platform is, to me, the healthcare for all. Mm-hmm. Or what is it? No, it's Medicare for all. It's M for A.
Yeah, so I guess I would just say that, like, Republicans are not going to help any more than the Democrats are. I think it's a bad system, and it's a bad system that...
Right.
The main issue is that it has been left unchecked.
Yeah, and when you've got two parties, the problem is, within each party, there's going to be a spectrum of the kind of people that you're going to have. So there's going to be, because the Overton window has shifted so far to the right, where people who claim to be centrist are really, compared to Canada, for example, really right-wing and conservative, then you're going to have a lot of Democrats who, in my mind, would have been Republicans 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. So, what I'm going to do is...
Yeah, so everybody sucks. Democrats suck, Republicans suck.
Equal opportunity.
Yeah, and it's not that, like, one of them doesn't suck more than the other. I think in the case of managing the police, though, historically, I don't think either of them have really been doing anything.
Yeah, neither
so
have
I
been
think
that great.
in terms of response to the police, I think both of them, from everything I've seen, and obviously I'd have to do more research to make such a sweeping claim and really feel like I could argue for it. Yeah. But I don't think either of them are better than the others. And I think in my mind, the issue is that they're not being held accountable. It doesn't matter who's not holding them accountable. Yeah. The point is nobody's holding them accountable.
Yeah. And I just want to throw a link out there. I mean, if we're going to talk statistics, so I've got there. I was doing a little bit of a search, and and as a public health thing. So what we're looking at is PubMed, and there are a number of studies. I'll link one that looks at unarmed deaths. And those are the kind of deaths that are actually the most interesting and the most telling, because it's harder to imagine any kind of great scenario that justifies shooting somebody who is unarmed.
Yeah.
And the title of the study was Deaths Due to Use of Lethal Force by Law Enforcement. And really quick in the abstract. Victims were majority white, 52%, but disproportionately black, 32%, with a fatality rate 2.8 times higher among blacks than whites. So the people are about 3 times more likely to be killed if they're black than white.
And we should say this is from 2009 to 2012.
Yes. And this is U.S. That's where most of the numbers are available, right?
Yeah.
So most victims were reported to be armed, 83%. However, black victims were more likely to be unarmed. That's 14.8% than white, 9.4%, or Hispanic, 5.8% victims. That's an interesting sort of twist.
Yeah.
But they were most likely to be unarmed. Like 50% more likely to be unarmed when they were killed. Fatality rates among military veterans, active duty service members were 1.4 times greater than among their civilian counterparts. 4 case subtypes were examined based on themes that emerged in incident narratives. About 22% of cases were mental health related. 18 were suspected. Suicide by cop incidents, with white victims more likely than black or Hispanic victims to die in these circumstances. So that's the suicide by cop one. Mm-hmm. And 14% involved intimate partner violence, and about 6% were unintentional deaths due to law enforcement action. Another 53% of cases were unclassified and did not fall into a coded subtype. Mm-hmm. Regression analyses identify victim and incident characteristics associated with each case subtype in unclassified cases. So you can make a case easily. Too many fatalities by law enforcement, totally across the board.
Yeah.
And you can also make the case that there's enough racism that black people are disproportionately affected by racism. Mm-hmm. And again, the key to me is you're 1.5 times more likely to be unarmed when killed if you're black. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean white people are completely protected. It's never that kind of those absolutes that we're talking about, right? But that seems pretty big, that you're 1.5 times more likely to be killed when unarmed than if you're black.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Out of like the total percentage of people who were killed, like,
yes,
yeah.
Yeah.
Because the math on that is hard. I'm not sure if that statement is actually fully accurate. A version of that is, but I think the way that you're saying it might not be exactly what the statistics mean.
It tells me that they were more likely to be unarmed. Like 15% of the black people that were killed were unarmed.
Yeah.
Less than 10% of the people who were
so out of the total people who were killed by cops, a much higher proportion of the black people were unarmed.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know how much more we can even say about.
Let's do another justice question. I need to cleanse my palate.
Oh, I got time. That makes sense. Okay. So our next question comes from Ruiz and Vatcha, and they say, as always, let us know how to pronounce your name if you want me to pronounce it better, because I'm sure I'm pronouncing everybody's names terribly, unless they're like white European names.
Right.
And they say, which character do you think changed the meta the most when they were first introduced? There's at least 8 to 10 which changed it a lot, I think. Character, not gear.
So there's 2 ways I think you can approach this question, right?
Yeah.
You can think about that change the meta. Changing the meta to me could mean either that this is a character that you could build your team around, where change your strategy. So this is the kind of these are the kind of fights that you wanted to have.
Yeah.
And then there's the characters to build a team strategy around because you're having to face them. And if you want to win, you need to know what to do against these characters.
Yeah, I'm going to say my 3, Raven, Ares, Red Sun, Green Lantern, are my 3, I think, big ones that come to mind fast.
Sorry, Red Sun, Green Lantern, okay.
Yeah.
You want to explain?
So Ares changed the meta because we were, like, for who to pick, right?
Right.
Because when Ares first came out, he was, like, a must-have in a quick grinding team. He was the quick character for getting through fights really fast. Raven super changed how you would play against her, because you always needed in your team a way of beating Raven, or you were screwed when you fought her. Right. It was really hard to just get lucky and beat Raven when you weren't specifically ready for Raven, especially right when she came out. Now it's a little bit easier.
Right.
And then Red Sun, Green Lantern, just because you could have a team that could win against anybody else and you'd struggle against Red Sun, Green Lantern. So you would also have to have something specifically in mind. You couldn't just rely on like crit related effects. And if you did, you would be screwed.
I'm going to argue against Red Sun, Green Lantern only because there's no real strategy that you can have against them. Like every team, when you lose crit damage, everybody's going to be struggling a little bit. And no stun and no crit damage.
So then I'll still argue for him that he changed the meta for what you put in as a defensive team.
Oh, I guess that's true. Fair enough.
Because you would see a ton of him.
Yeah. I've got a few, actually, and I'm thinking historically, too. So, in my mind, Batgirl was huge. If you're talking Ares, Batgirl was really important because before you had before you had Tanty Totem, before you had Master's Death card, and actually even before you had Ra's al Ghul Scimitar, that might have come out around the same time. So you had Ra's al Ghul Scimitar. It would still take a while to get the second bar of power for Ares to really be game changing. Yeah. So Batgirl was almost de rigueur. You had to have her if you're going to be doing a Ares team where you're going to be spending a lot of time struggling. Shazam, I think, because of his passive, he was sort of the precursor to Tanty Totem. He was available as a rare drop later on, and I think around the same time, or close to the same time, Killing Joke Joker was available. So that team up made a huge difference where you could let Killing Joke Joker die and use Shazam to wipe out the rest of the enemy team.
Yeah.
I'm going to also say Killer Frost because she was the first power dampening. And early on, that made a big difference. Before you had really big basic damage dealers and before you had easy specials, the specials were still the bigger part of the damage, and it made, before you sort of amped up both the basic damage and specials was still, to me, more important than the basic damage. And when you were facing Killer Frost, you were really up against it.
That's a good point.
When Arkham Origins Deathstroke came out, it was not so much a big shift, but there was a small shift because when you were facing him in multiplayer, and before they fixed him so that he didn't always get 200%, if he came in with a bar of power, you were dead.
Yeah.
And that was really unbalancing. So you had to, back then, that's when it became so important to have a real meat shield. Somebody on your team that you didn't care about, and you had to have more than one person on your team that could have offensive potential to fight back when Arkham Origins Deathstroke just dropped a special one, and whoever was in front of him was out.
Yeah.
Reverse Flash was one of the first guys that made people shift a little bit away from specials, because Reverse Flash came up before Tantu Totem. So it meant that you couldn't rely completely on specials. You couldn't have a specials team. You'd had to have at least a certain amount of basic damage. Flashpoint Batman, before Tantu Totem came, he was unbalancing for the game, because it meant that that was the really big shift towards basic damage. But my memory might be failing me, because part of me thinks that maybe they came around the same time where Tantu Totem came first. But I feel like Flashpoint came...
I don't 100% remember.
I'd have to take a look at that. And then I think finally Batman Ninja Catwoman. So she's the one that's making a lot of people field teams that have 2 pieces of LexCorp gears just to counteract her passive.
Yeah, so there we go. We're out of video. Talked a lot about politics this week. We didn't get to all of our questions, which, spoiler alert,
even from
many are political. Yeah. So look forward to those. We're not done talking about that, and I don't think we will be anytime soon. So if you're one of those people who...
Unless we go hide in a hole.
That's true. If you're one of those people who doesn't like us talking about politics, I would say...
Wait for Thursdays.
I would say this content is probably no longer for you. But if you've gotten all the way to this point, that's probably not you anyways. You probably are at least all right with it, because I can't imagine listening through to this entire episode if you're the type of person who does not want us to talk about politics. Yeah, we'll do our best to continue to alienate the people who came to us for Just Injustice originally, and maintain whatever it is our current audience is. So, anyways, to finish up, we have some people that we would like to say some words about. First off, a shout out to Eliza the Voice Caton. She bought a blue snowball mic and now sends me clips of her reading random copy pastas for practice. Suggest what she should read next in the comments. This shout out has been brought to you by an old man in an antique store who told her she should do voice work as a job, and who she's taken the advice of.
Your mom's gotten that too.
Yeah. We'd also like to give a massive thank you to all the people who support us on Patreon. So that is a thank you to Consul Peasant and Edwoon, who are supporting us at the highest tier Last Word, Mohammed Albshaiti at the Your Message Here tier, Shawn Farrell, Daniel Simonson, Aaron Maule, Michael DeVries, Brandon C., and Irvin Ruiz, who support us on the credited level, and Chris Wolf, Scarlet Danny, Awesome Gamer 241, Pavu RS, and Gavin Malott at the gratitude level. Thank you all so much for your support, and thanks so much to all of you for watching, liking, commenting, whatever it is you do. However you engage with this, if you're here, you've given us some amount of support, and we thank you for that. We'll see you next time.
Komoda.